To the Jayda InStitches Show, January part 2 of our 2025 calendar unblanket project. We will be referring you back to today's video throughout the course of the year. This will be a technique video on how to apply those appliques, how to stitch them down, how to deal with layering appliques, and how to deal with appliques that might be multiple pieces like our polar bear. We're going to have a few ideas for, layouts, how to, best practices, tips for sewing, pausing, making sure nothing moves around, stuff like that. So that's what today's tutorial is going to be. And like I said, we're going to be referring you back to this tutorial all throughout the year if you have questions on how to sew down appliques. We want to focus most of the rest of this year's 2025 calendar unblanket videos on some interesting techniques, some really fun designs, and of course, playing with color. So without further ado, let's grab your appliques, and they can be these ones, they can be other wintry ones, they can be, well, whatever says January to you. We've got a full playlist of appliques in the description box down below that you can peruse at your leisure. Grab your hooks and yarn, we'll head on over to the craft table and we will apply some appliques to our canvas together. In order to add appliques to our canvas, you want to first have some appliques or an idea of how you want to decorate your canvas. Now the canvas isn't super wide, so a couple of appliques will generally get the idea across. And of course you can also do a little of embroidery too, if you're so inclined, but I'll get to that in a minute. First, choose your appliques. We've got links to our polar bear, our evergreen trees, and if you're more a snowman type of person, or maybe just falling snowflakes, we've got links to applique tutorials for those in the description box down below as well. You want to lay out all your appliques in the manner in which you'd like to see them first, sort of set the scene for yourself. I like to try and keep my appliques on the inside edge of my little frame. And if you feel it necessary, you can pin them into place, but most of the time, yarn being what it is, these will pretty much stay in place when you pat them down. And it also lets you kind of shuffle things around a little bit until you get the look that you like. When it's time to start sewing, you want to sew down the pieces that are closest to the canvas. So for example, my polar bear is 3 pieces layered atop each other. And the first piece I would want to sew down is the back end. So I would just peel back the first 2 pieces. I can reposition them again later. And then I want to make sure that I've got this piece in the right spot. I grab the long tail that I left behind on it, thread it up in my yarn needle, and I'm going to use the top facing loops of my actual canvas to anchor my applique to. So I'm not going to sew all the way through the canvas. I'm just going to use the top facing loops. These are the top facing loops. When you have it in position, you peel back the edge and you look for the top facing loop of a stitch right below where you want it to be anchored. Right below. So you would then use the piece or the stitch along the edge of your applique and the top facing loop. And I'm just going to zoom in so you can really see what I'm talking about here. So this is the top facing loop of a stitch. This is my applique. I peel it back. This is a loop of a stitch directly below where I want to sew. Go to the next one, peel it back. That's a loop right underneath the stitch I'm going to sew into. And every stitch, or especially when I just get started, I lay the whole thing back down, pat it, make sure it hasn't moved out of position. And again, peel it back. There's a loop that I can grab right underneath the stitch I want to sew into. Here's the next one, and the next stitch. And I keep pausing to make sure that I haven't accidentally moved it out of alignment. It's not shuffling around on me. It becomes much more important when I get to the legs and the feet, because I want the legs and feet to be kind of in a position. You can kind of bend things the way you want them to when you're putting down an applique. But as you put in more stitches, it will move less, but I still like to pause every few stitches to make sure that I haven't accidentally had it slide, I haven't missed a stitch. And then in this fashion, you just slowly work your way around the entire applique, paying close attention to the corners and the little bits that move. But I'll hook up with you down here in a minute. I've stitched all the way around the edge, keeping in mind that a lot of the front of this piece is going to be hidden underneath piece number 2 of my polar bear. So I really only worried about every other stitch to kind of keep this in place, knowing that it's going to be covered largely by another couple of pieces. So anything that you know is going to be hidden underneath another piece, you don't have to worry too much about getting every single stitch. But here I am down in a corner. I want to make sure now that my legs are going to sit in the position that I want them to, and that my little feet are turned out and look like they're actually sort of stomping along through the snow. I am, after all, telling a bit of a story here. So I'm going to make sure that I definitely get the stitch in the inside corner of this leg. And then, as I work down the edge of this leg, I'm going to make sure that I'm not letting it move around. It's a small piece. Small pieces can want to shift a little bit. And of course, as I stitch, I want to make sure that I'm capturing a bit of movement. I want those legs to look like he's just paused ever so briefly to sort of look out of the picture he's in while he's wandering through the woods. I want to make sure that I pay attention to this inside little edge here. And I don't want to split my yarn, so let me just get the rest of that stitch. There we go. And now, because I'm doing a small little spot, I'm going to zoom in again here for you guys. Because I'm doing a very small little spot, I want to make sure that I anchor it. Sometimes I might even anchor the same stitch in a couple of different places, because I want to make sure that it keeps its round little shape. So first, it's okay if they get shuffled around a little bit, I will be putting everything back. I'm going to do this. This is sort of entering into his toes or the end of his edge of his foot. Now I want to make sure I get to the very front of his toes. And that feels pretty firm. Now I'm going to come under here, and I'm going to make sure that I get a stitch directly underneath his foot. And it hasn't moved on me, so that's good. I make sure to pay attention that I get every single stitch around a tiny curve. So if I'm going into a curve, around sort of inside curve or outside curve, curves are very important. So I want to make sure I definitely use every stitch around a curve. And if it's a small piece, I want to make sure that it doesn't move away on me. It's in the right position. And I'm going to do the same thing all the way up this leg. Kind of peel back the leg. Look for a stitch directly underneath it. And that's looking pretty good. I'm going to stitch all the way up here into the corner and then back down, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make sure that I make sure his little foot is exactly where I want it. I'm going to stitch all the way around the foot, all the way back up around his little tail, and then I'll be back where I started, right up here, and I'll catch up with you there. When you've finished sewing all the way around a piece and you get to the end, make a very small knot somewhere right at the side of the applique. I like to use a loop of the applique itself. And by a small knot, I mean the kind of knot that you would create when you were fastening off your yarn if you were just crocheting. Make sure it's nice and tight, and then I like to bring my needle in underneath to the inside edge of the applique and then just weave that tail in underneath some of the stitches of the actual applique. And it's just like anything else. Weave it in through a few stitches, double back through a few more, sort of the same ones, but then maybe a couple more. And you do that 2 or 3 times until you have woven in all of your yarn. Make sure you don't pull any stitches out of alignment, so don't weave too tightly, or until it's tight enough that you feel like that's definitely not going to come out. And then trim your yarn, and there's another little scrap that I can put back in my scrap heap. Then you go back and you continue to lay out all of the pieces that belong on top of each other. So I'm going to reposition my polar bear pieces to make sure that I like where they sit. And then I'm going to start all over again, stitching down piece number 2. And I do the same thing, stitch a couple stitches, make sure it hasn't moved. But in this case, I am now using the top facing loops of the previous applique, because that's what's directly underneath the new piece that I'm sewing down. And you can use same method. You want to grab a loop of the top facing loops of a stitch directly beneath the edge, pausing every so often to make sure it hasn't moved on you. And you just do the same thing. Work all the way around, taking extra care on the insides and the outsides of curves, and making sure that you position your legs, your feet, or those little pieces as you work to make sure that they're in the right position, or kind of doing what you want them to. Do you want them to have a little bit of activity? Do you want them to look like they're waving in the wind? You just want them to be straight up and down. Take your time, work your way around, and then same thing. When you're all the way back, make a small knot, fasten off, and weave in that tail along some of the insides of the stitches. Once you've got part number 2 of especially something like the polar bear stitched down and knotted, then you go to the last part. So every time you're dealing with multiple layers on a piece for applique purposes, you want to make sure that you stitch down the one that is fully connected to the back first, and then in order. Now, if these were also overlapping, let's say that this leg was overlapping the bottom of this tree, then you'd want to make sure that you stitch down this tree first, then this tree, and then after you stitch down the back of the bear, if you have a piece that overlaps multiples, make sure you're stitching down everything in order. So for example, this tree fully connects to the back. It's not overlapping anything. This tree is overlapping this tree. And if I wanted to have this leg over top of this tree, I would have to have my 2 trees stitched down first before I went and stitched down the first part of my, or the second part of my bear. But in this case, I kind of want him just a little bit away from the tree because I kind of like him standing out against the white snow. But that said, now I've got to put the bear's head in place. I don't need to have my trees there just yet because I know that I will be positioning them on their own. They're kind of their own little thing. So I've threaded up the long tail, and I'll do the same thing. Position the head of the bear where I want it, and then I start. Some of the stitches that I will be using will be off of the back of the actual canvas, and the majority of them will be around other pieces of the appliques. Same thing though, I'm going to pay close attention to the corners, the inside curves, the outside curves, and every couple of stitches, because it's a smaller piece especially, I want to make sure that it's not moving on me, so I will pause after every single stitch and just make sure that it's still in the right place. And of course, once you get a few stitches in, it will start to move around a whole lot less. And just like before, I'm going to go all the way around the ear, across the top, around the other ear, make a little knot, weave in my tail, and that'll be my bear down. I've finished stitching down my polar bear, and now it's time to move on to my trees. Obviously, I need to do the big tree first because it's the one in the background. It is behind this tree, and it is completely touching the canvas. In the event that you're dealing with an applique that has two different colored strings, so in this case we've got the big green tree and it has its own green yarn for stitching, and there's a little bit of a brown trunk and that has a little brown bit of yarn for stitching. I like to, I don't know, decide which part of the tree makes the most sense to start with. In this case, I'm going to go with the small trunk for a couple reasons. One, it's easy to get this small piece stitched down, and two, it will help to anchor the tree. It won't go anywhere or have a much harder time moving around once I have this stitched down. So same thing, I'm going to grab little loops of the front facing stitches all along the edge of the trunk. And when I get to the top, because I need to stitch down these three sides, and I started here, I'm just going to run the yarn through these stitches and continue on the other side. But when I get there, I'll show you what that looks like. Alright, I've stitched along the bottom and the side. Now I'm just going to run this yarn right through these stitches, almost as though I were weaving in the tail. I'm going to make sure that I don't pull it out of alignment or pull too tightly. My tree has not moved. I've still got it in the right position, and now I'm just going to stitch down these other two little rows here. This is a small piece, so I don't have to worry about making too many stitches. I probably could have left myself a slightly longer tail for sewing, but it's enough. I'm going to make a little knot now on the end. Nice and tight. There we go. And then I'm going to weave this little tail in underneath those stitches. And because there's so little tail left, I'm going to weave it in back and forth until it completely disappears, because I don't really want it to unravel or have the end popping out, because it's kind of a, it's an interesting little textured yarn, and it already wants to, as you can see, it wants to kind of unravel. The little ply are all spitting apart. Not a big deal though. I'm gonna just double back through these little stitches. This is pretty tight, so I'm not too worried about this tail wanting to come undone. There we go. And make sure that it doesn't get pulled too tightly there. And I will just trim those little tails that are left. Be very careful when trimming your tails that you don't accidentally cut the loops that you're working on. And now I've attached that tree trunk, and now my tree is less likely to move around on me, and I can now move on to stitching down the tree. This tree is the tallest. I want to make sure that it's standing at its fullest height. So because I've anchored the foot already, or its trunk, I can kind of pull up on it a little bit to make sure that it's not sort of getting crushed down or crunched. And I can start stitching right at the top. So I'm going to do exactly what I've been doing all along. I'm going to grab a top facing loop from the canvas and start stitching all the way down the side. Every couple of stitches before I've got several in, I'm going to pause and make sure that it hasn't moved on me. And I'm just grabbing loops of the edge of each row or so all the way down the side of this tree. Nothing really any different than any other stitching. I want to make sure that my stitches are largely hidden. Pause every so often. I'm going to go all the way down here, and then I'm going to run my green yarn underneath the trunk. I'll show you that when I get there. I've done stitching all the way down the side across to the bottom edge, and just like I did with the brown yarn coming across those stitches, I'm just going to run my needle underneath the tree, and I'm being careful not to go through to the back, and I can sort of feel that I'm grabbing the odd little stitch from underneath. I'm going to pull not too tightly because I don't want to pull anything out of alignment. I'm going to pause every once in a while, make sure that I haven't done that. Everything still looks nice and straight. And then I'm going to just continue stitching along the other side. So I'm still grabbing front facing loops. I'm still making sure that I get every other stitch, especially up the side is maybe every other stitch just because it's a long straight line. There we go. And now the home stretch. I'm going to stitch all the way up here, make a little knot, weave in my tail, and then I'll be on to tree number 2. That's the big background tree stitched down. Now I'm going to stitch down the smaller tree that sits in the foreground. I'm just going to make sure that it's positioned in such a way that you can sort of see that there's a difference between the trees. One sits a little lower than the other. I'm kind of looking for a bit of interest, I suppose. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to stitch down the trunk first, across the bottom, up the top, or the side I should say, slip my yarn through those top stitches and then down the bottom, knot it off, and then I will start at the top with the green all the way down the side, across the bottom, slip it underneath the trunk, and across the side to finish. And of course some of those stitches will be anchored into the tree that sits directly behind it. So wherever the loop that's directly behind where you need to stitch it sits, you use that loop, regardless of whether it's part of the canvas or if it's another applique. If it's sitting on top of that applique, then you use the stitches of that applique. And that's all you need to do. That will sort of take care of my big appliques, and there's just a couple of little finishing touches left. And there we go. I have all 3 of my main appliques on. They're stitched down nice and neat and tidy. And if you flip the whole thing over, because I used the top facing loops of the canvas itself and layered appliques, you cannot see any stitching showing through to the back. So if seeing stitching in the back is something that kind of drives you a little crazy, definitely use the top facing loop method for sewing down your appliques. So not very difficult, just perhaps a little bit time consuming, and not a big problem if you leave yourself a nice long sewing tail. So if you're ever in doubt, leave yourself a little extra tail for sewing. You can tie in more yarn to keep sewing if the need arises, but it's a bit annoying trying to navigate around a knot. So I do recommend leaving yourself a long tail. It's better to have too much than not enough, and then you can take those little bits of yarn and put them back in the stash, because you never know when you might need them for the rest of this year. And like I said, if you missed our sort of yarn stash cleaning, organizing video, I'll link to that in the description box down below. This is a great use of all those little scraps, the big ones, the small ones, the super tiny ones. Organize them, keep them handy. You're going to use them up this year and you'll feel so good that you did. And like I said, if you want to do all 12 of the months or only one of the month or make all of the months the same, it's entirely up to you. You can stitch them together in a blanket. You can add whatever appliques you want. And we've got a little bit more coming for January. So stay tuned. We'll see you Monday. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe and crafty. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you guys soon. Bye!
Hi everybody, Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.